Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this event. My name is Chu Chang. I'm the discussant and moderator tonight. I'm a PhD student at Lingnan University Cultural Study Department, and I'm also an independent curator. So I would like to, first of all, congratulate Surabhi and Taiju and all the musicians and participants for this wonderful documentary. And thank you, Taiju, for inviting me. I'm very honored and also terrified to share my thoughts about this film because I'm a complete layman of traditional music, both in India and in China. But I do hope my non-professional perspective to help to open the conversation in a more accessible way and to encourage more of you from the audience to share your thoughts and insights later during the Q&A session. And please feel free to leave any questions or comments in the chat box throughout the conversation, and we can pick them up and talk about them. So to start the conversation, I'd like to talk a little about my impression of the documentary, and I will follow by 1 to 2 questions, each to Surabhi and to Taiju to kick the conversation going. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the structure and the design of the film. Movement Traces is a 70-minute documentary, presents the learning, the singing, the humming, the music playing, the rehearsing, and the pre-performance warm-ups among the musicians from India and China, with fragments of personal reflections cut into the footages in written forms. There is no full-length formal performances of songs in the documentary, and there's not even a long duration of conversations in the film, at least not conversation in the common sense. It is the repetition of singing, music playing, trial and errors that present themselves as conversation of a sort and occupied a large part of the documentary. Meanwhile, there's no. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hear some noises, sorry. And meanwhile, there's no overwhelming narrative coming from the director or the curator to tell the viewers what they're seeing or what the journey is about. In this way, I feel that the film is presenting an open ground of musical communications in which one needs to find or create their own traces or their own roots in order to delve into the rather abstract musical conversation. To take my own experience as an example, at the beginning of the film, I was struck by Kim Ho's remark about musical work represents the trace of a movement. And through his reminder, I started to pay attention to the musician's bodily movements throughout the film. For instance, when Zhang Yi plays the Hindustani tune on pipa, his bodily gesture appears to me as more forceful and dramatic. Or when Bintu Malini and Rutuja sing Zhelai's song, their bodily movements as well as facial expressions were completely different from when they were singing in their own languages. And then there are also similarities in terms of bodily movement. For instance, I noticed when the musicians were immersed by the music, they would close their eyes and then move their heads from left to right, almost in a simultaneous way. So structure-wise, I find the film was able to, on one hand, highlight the musical crossing, the musical exchange as a form of conversation and dialogue, and on the other hand, provide an extremely open script for the viewers to generate their own understanding and narratives about the musical exchange. So this leads me to my second thought, which is related to this idea of musical conversation. I remember when I was first invited by Taiju to a listening event to the Saath-Saath Project, I understood the music presented during the event as a negotiation between the Chinese and Indian musicians. And I asked a rather silly question to the participating musician about the negotiation process. And I think the film basically presented to me this process that I was wondering about, which made me realize that negotiation was really an incorrect use of term, as negotiation somehow presupposes that there is a common ground to be reached. But throughout the film, one thing I was sensing strongly was the fact that there's no common ground to be reached. Even when the musicians were playing and singing the same song, the history, the musical tradition, even the sense of familiarity and unfamiliarity were completely different for everyone participated. So rather to say that it is a negotiation, I think what Bintu Malini said about an attempt dialogue would be a better term to describe this crossing or this exchange. Although the musical crossing has created an open ground, an expanding ground, this open ground is also a very uneven terrain to me. And I think no musician can stay comfortably at one place and thought that they are on the same page with the others. I think the musicians in the Saath-Saath Project are consciously not to reach an agreement, but to construct a space or a soundscape that requires themselves and the viewers to physically hike and trek while being unsure of the final destination, according to one of the musicians. I remember in the film, Rutuja says what she was doing was layering the musical structure. And Bintu Malini says that during the process, she needs to remind herself to be comfortable in the realm of I don't know. And I think they are describing exactly this experience of constructing and traveling through such a musical space. And also this attempt dialogue is not just between the musicians, it is also between the viewer and the documentary, as I mentioned earlier about how one needs to generate their own traces in the film. And the last thing that I want to talk about is a rather minor comment. When watching the film, I was constantly reminded of the Chinese concept of qing, which is related to this idea of feeling and emotions, but has a much broader connotation. Classical Chinese poetry and music making both revolves heavily around the expression and the releasing of emotion and feeling. And in this film, when I saw the musicians' bodily movements following the rhythm in various ways, their facial expressions and their eye contacts with each other, and their bodily gesture that link each other in the music, in the rhythm, I felt that this musical crossing is also a confluence of feeling and emotion. And when Bintu Malini speaks about how musical exchange alters the scope of the voice and even the body, I cannot help but thinking about this idea of how emotions are generated through our contact with each other and with the world, and how they impressed upon us and shape us. And in this way, cultural crossings and being together could perhaps be an experience as a way to reshape ourselves and to reshape each other. A friend from an experimental artistic community in China has once described to me the way of working together within their community, which is to experience, to work together based on minimal consensus. In Chinese, it is 在最低的共识的基础下共同工作. And in Saath-Saath soundscape making, I think I'm also sensing this effort. And it's really beautiful to experience being together in music and in sound. I try to speak really quickly so to leave enough time for us to discuss. So now I will try to pose my questions to our curator and the director. So a question to Surabhi. I spoke about my feeling in terms of how the film is structured, is designed, and I do want to hear you to speak more about how you are handling the material, especially since you're using footages of rehearsal and behind the stage practices. I'm sure you have hours and hours of footages, but 70 minutes is really a very restrained amount of time. So I was wondering, how was your selection process was like? How did you piece these footages together? And then to Taiju, this is more about your process as a curator, because there are multiple crossings within the documentary. We can see that there are exchange between musical instruments and musical traditions, languages and texts, and also pop music and traditional music. And then there is one thing that is not highlighted in the film, but you can also notice that the location changes constantly within the film. And I'm sure that this sense of a different environment is also an exchange in terms of space and the musicians. So how did you curate this type of exchange? Especially the Indian musicians are mostly vocalists, and the Chinese musicians are string instrument players, and there's also vocalists as well. So is there conscious decision behind all these crossings? So this would be my questions.
Teju, you want to go first?
Okay, I thought the question was asked to you first, Surabhi, but anyway, I think this will set the stage for what we're trying to attempt. I hope I'll have a few more turns to come back and explain more about the project. But, you know, like all exciting projects, these things begin because of, you know, serendipity. Like I ended up in Hong Kong, where I've spent 5 years. I've left a short while ago. And once one ends up there, one is working with Hindustani music, working with the same people, working with Surabhi, with whom I made other films before. Somehow when one began to think about musical collaborations, because some of my earlier work, especially in the Caribbean years ago, had to do with musical collaborations. So I think I've always been fascinated by musical languages and how they might bridge various kinds of gaps. And for me, there's nothing more opaque than the relationship between South Asia and China. Although there is such a deep history to this and such, I think, a closeness, a proximity, the history of the modern world seems to have completely changed that in such a way that, like, it has happened in many parts of the world as well, with the rise of nation states, with colonialism, with the formation of new kinds of boundaries. It seems like we are now extremely opaque to one another. And I think it's, for me, that was a kind of challenge. And I wondered if music had worked for me earlier to try and, in a very difficult maneuver, make some connection with the other in that space. Maybe it might work this time as well. So that what set me off. I'm an amateur practitioner of music myself, and I'm, you know, someone who is a great fan of all the young people who are in the project, separately from their being in the project. And I've always followed their careers. So it was inevitable when I thought of putting together a collaboration that I would ask precisely these people. I wanted to ask the younger generation of musicians. I also want to emphasize here that vocal music is somewhat privileged in India, and that's a different history which we can't go into here. But I've written a book about this question and many other related questions, which is called Musicophelia in Mumbai. Many of you might know it. If you don't, you can look it up. And that is, in many ways, conceptually a precursor to this project. So in Musicophelia in Mumbai, I talked about the rise and emergence of Hindustani music in urban areas and the formation of new publics that were listening publics. That's the broad direction in which the book is going. Surabhi has made a film connected to the research. We've also done many other things there as a result of the research being connected to the film and to other kinds of art practices. So in a sense, there was that continuity. There was an attempt to do research by other means. I'm an academic, but I like to think of myself as a somewhat non-standard academic. And I've always really enjoyed trying to extend the bounds of what might seem to be, merely conceptual thinking, to work in the area of engaging with the practice, especially artistic practice, cultural practices of different kinds. So this is how I brought some of these interests together and asked these people to collaborate. They were vocalists because vocal music is privileged in India, as I just pointed out. So whenever in Hong Kong I said my musicians are coming, they would say, which instruments do they play? And that puzzled me, because in India, when we say musicians, we usually mean vocalists. And it took me a while to figure that the instrument is what is privileged in China because of a very, very different history of how modernity, the music comes into modernity in a way. So maybe there'll be other questions about that, but I think that's enough for now to say what the beginnings of the project were. I'll hand over to Surabhi.
Thanks, Teju. Chang, thank you for a very, very, very beautiful response to the film. You made me like the film quite a lot. to your question, that was the crux of my struggle for the last, I think, a year and a half. And even while I was shooting it, I had no idea how I planned to put it together. I shot extensively. I did not shoot many stages of this amazing project. I was there only at pivotal moments in the last 2 years. But I'm going to attempt to answer this question that you asked about my structure. So for the longest time, I had no structure. I had sequences of individual musical pieces in separate spaces. So it took me a while to break the boundaries of the physical spaces we were in and to sort of traverse through certain musical pieces. And I had enough material to complete a musical piece and show a kind of the journey of the starting to the completion. Luckily, in the interim time, the musicians actually pulled off all their collaborations and completed their marvelous 2 albums that they have produced of all the finished pieces of work. That freed me of trying to show the journey of individual pieces. And then I started sort of culling through all my material, and I started focusing on precisely what you remarked on, which was, in a sense, the listening, the moments of vulnerabilities of musicians who are somehow dislodged from their comfort zone and trying hard to get back their center. And I started working with that idea, which is why you do notice the bodily presence, the oral presence of these singers, So I began working with that, and then again I sort of started meandering towards how do I build a certain build up? How do we move from point A to point whatever D in a kind of a journey, or to let a story unfold? And I started sort of resisting that idea and realized I was moving in circles, in loops, and that's how a kind of a structure sort of emerged, where again I wanted it to be an open-ended space so that someone who has no idea of Hindustani music or Chinese classical music or folk traditions that both Jelai and Bindu brought into the fold at some point in time, to sort of remove that knowledge and make it about listening to that sound that gets repeated over and over again. That is when you start hearing what is difficult, what is tricky, what is making individual singers sort of feel slight uneasiness. And that tension is what I started sort of building on. And that's how the structure emerged. I tried at one point to mix up the musical pieces so that we don't even hear the musical pieces in a flow. But I went back to that original structure because I started seeing each musical piece as a space where you go round and round and do not sort of complete it. And for the completed pieces, actually, the album is there, out there. It's part of this project. So, I was really free of that burden in a sense. So it's a loop that you're going through over and over again. But every time you go through that loop of a new piece, there's small variations. So that's how I was sort of thinking it through. But the voice, the silence I forced in through the text. That's how I, in fact, try to eliminate all spoken voice. But then there were some bits that just flowed in beautifully, and I stayed with that, so that you're sort of forcing silence in a way that is not present in the material, but just to then go back into the next loop. And each loop, I'm hoping, gave you a certain different texture, if not meaning and emotion, as you said.
Thank you. I think for me, as a Chinese, there is also this sense of progression for me, because at the beginning, it was the Indian musician teaching Zhang Yi to play the Hindustani tune on pipa, and then it moves on to the Indian musician learning Chinese and to combine the Chinese lyric in their music. And then it moves on to them singing Chinese music. So for me, there's this progression into familiarity. And I started to, in this process of finding my way to understand their crossings, their exchange, I started to hearing more and more familiar sounds, and it became this very fluent, very smooth experience for me. And I was thinking, for an Indian viewer, for example, it's a process completely the other way around. Yeah. And then for someone who's foreign to both cultures, then it's a completely different experience. And I see that we have some of the musicians here. I wonder if it's the first time that you guys having a discussion after the film is done.
We are actually, but I'm hoping the wonderful musicians who are here can jump in and give their. It's the first time I'm seeing the singers, the musicians silent.
Maybe
I think Gogo, you can just call out their names and they will.
Yeah.
I'll call up into Hamini's name first, because there's so many quotes from you in the documentary, and I don't have a lot of them.
That just shows that I think I spoke a lot. I kept speaking, I guess. So thank you for this, and the kind of questions and the way you have observed the film really opened up a lot for me, in fact, because I think it's difficult. I was telling Teju and Surabhi that I will have to watch it a few times to also step out and look at my own self as part of what's going on. Sometimes it will take a few rounds of viewing it, and every viewing reads differently for me, or it opens up something else. And like you said, in the second or the third time that I watched, the listening, the way Surabhi has kind of settled on the listening and the gestures and those silent movements of the body, the voice, of course not silent, but that reading is coming through beautifully. And I think it's precious for me to witness it now after so many years of gap, and to relive that moment through those lens in a way, because these are not done consciously, but they were very much there. And where language really had to take a back seat. So the body spoke a lot, the silences spoke a lot in the communication. And that's somewhere cutting through in the film, I feel. Yeah, I mean, I can always come back for something again. Should I nominate the next?
Sure.
Shall I?
Hello， 喂，能听到吗？
听得到，你可以用中文讲，然后我可以帮你翻译。
太好了。
嗯。
然后我等一下。对，现在要说我的感受是吧？
对，就是你看了影片之后的感受。
对，然后我首先谢谢那个导演，谢谢那个谢谢你来拍这个片子的这个想法，就是我一点一点说，我有点混乱，就是
我可以帮你翻译，然后你可以讲你下面一段。So first of all, July would like to express her gratitude to Surabhi for making this documentary.
第一件事情是，就是我一点开那个视频，前2分钟就是我的声音，然后我一直在找那个音高，然后一直在跑调，然后哒哒的，然后就找不到，然后我觉得这个就是让我听了以后，Oh my god， 然后又想到了当时就是那个我在印度学习的这个过程，是从我的音高从有到没有， 然后又找到那个音高的一个过程，挺可。
So she was talking about for the first 2 minutes in the documentary, the first thing that she heard was her own singing voices. And then she was like missing her tune, and it was very embarrassing for her to listen to that part. And that reminded her of her learning process when she was in India. And the first thing that she was learning was about the scale, right? How to find her scale, how to tune her voice to adjust to the scale in the Indian music, I think.
然后就是第二个部分是我看到有字幕的那个地方是黑色的底，然后有白白的字，然后那个地方是没有讲话的，然后整个片子都是没有讲话的，然后我觉得这个就是让我会感觉到更有内在的这种情感，就更愿意去思考很多。然后我在看的时候，我都是好像都不是我自己参加过的一个记录。然后也会更就是很感动。
So the second part she wants to talk about is when those fragments of thoughts appear on the screen. Those parts are the silent parts, and she felt that the silent can really invoke inner feelings, and that made her feel like she's not even a participant of this project, but a viewer that is looking into this project, and that was really moving to her.
Oh, lovely.
还有我觉得还有好多，就是我在这几年里学习的过程里面的一些特别有意思的经历。因为我的英文不好，所以又让我的那个 body language， 然后又很想表达，所以它也有就是让我自己的表达就是更从内在的想要去释放很多。就是我记得在孟买的那个音乐节演出的那次，然后是真的让我很感动，就是有所有的音乐家和观众一起的那个事件让我很记忆犹新。然后对，先这么多。
And she was also hoping to talk about how she started to build up this urge to express her inner feeling throughout this project, because her English isn't really good, so she learned to express herself through body language, and this process made her having this urge to express herself more, and she can recall a lot of past memories that were extremely moving and important to her. For example, the music festival in Mumbai. She said that it was a time where the audience and the musicians were playing together, and that was extremely fond memories of hers. 先这么多，
谢谢。对，然后就是谢谢导演，然后谢谢大家，就对，谢谢。
Thank you to everyone. 哲来，你可以点名下一个来回应的音乐人。
下一个冰毒，他刚讲了已经是。
他刚讲了，
那就那个瑞图加。
Your name, Rituja.
First of all, I'm so thrilled and grateful to be a part of this event. And this watching this movie just made me realize the way this journey was so special to my being as a musician, and the way it shaped me as a musician, wherein it was just not about being restricted to my practice, but also made me realize that knowing another language strengthens to know your own language. And the way this movie has been beautifully, it has beautifully woven all our moments of resistance. Also, wherein we were also trying to find some sort of a common ground to know each other's language. I think the entire theme, the entire journey was so very well expressed through the movie, and through the frames, and through the thoughts which even I was not aware, okay, did I think this even only after watching this, it made me realize that okay, this was the space I was actually building when I was trying to find myself. Also, as you rightly mentioned about the moments of vulnerability and then trying to get back to the center. So these were the moments which we all could witness throughout the project, and I think the movie just gives us an indicator and shows us this that this was the journey, this was the movement we all took throughout the project. And yeah, I have no words right now to say, because I'm really very, very overwhelmed to just see, to just witness that this was the journey we were all a part of. And this movie just gave me that experience. And I also, as Bindu rightly mentioned, that I need to watch this once more and like over and over again, so as to be able to appreciate even more. And uh, this webinar is also making me realize and appreciate the journey even more. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Rutuja. And I think we have Omkar.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. So first of all, I'm here to express my immense gratitude to everybody present here, and our beloved Surabhi and Teju, everybody who gave me an opportunity to be a part of this, and the amazing musicians, Rutuja, Bindu Malini, Zilai, Zangi, Kimho, everybody who welcomed me and taught me so many things. Speaking at the end is difficult because people who speak before you, they pretty much cover everything that what one is feeling. So I totally second what Bindu and Rutuja has to say about how special this experience has been for all of us. And one of the major things that I learned in this process of Saath-Saath was how musicians from other countries approach to learn Indian classical music. That is a perspective that an Indian musician will not know, because we are born and brought up with Indian classical music, surrounded by it all the time. So that music is sort of in genes, and it is a household part for all of us. But for somebody like Zilai or Zangi, when they come and they prepare to learn, so that preparation of learning and the methodology of learning another form of music, I think that was a very fascinating learning experience for me. So that is a big takeaway for me, and I think, yeah, I really enjoyed that aspect. Apart from interaction with everybody, how a musician prepares to learn a new form of music, I think that was really, really special in this. Yeah. Back to the panel.
Thank you, Omkar. And I think that's all the musicians here, right?
So I was going to
Yeah.
jump in here,
Mhm.
Changchu, to just say that there is a question you asked, which I think needs to be addressed. You said, how did you put together the different locations? And I'm impressed that you were able to figure out the different locations by looking at the sequences, because a comment that came from one viewer was, this could just well be anywhere in the world. How do we know this is in China, or how do we know this is happening in X place, right? And I wondered how other viewers responded. I would love to hear, and I think also would like to hear from Surabhi what she had in mind when she cut the film in this way. All the sequences you saw were shot either in Hong Kong, in Jinzhe near Shanghai, in Beijing. These were the places, right? So mostly shot in East Asia and not in India at all. But the focus on the interaction doesn't really tell us very much about the location. So I'm actually curious, Gogo, how you came up with the location question. Did the film give you this idea, or because you know about the project that you were trying to emphasize that matter? Because for me, it was important to house the project in different locations and to have the musicians travel. So the Chinese musicians came to India. The Indian musicians went to different parts of China, to Hong Kong as well, right?
Mhm.
So the movement traces are not only about the movement of Kim Ho's mallets, also the actual bodily movement of the musicians as they went along to these places. So just curious about the location question.
Well, the footages are mostly indoors, so I wouldn't be able to really tell where they are, but you can see the scenario changes. And then, for example, the clothing also changes. So you know it's like a different time and space. So you constantly sense this change of space and change of time throughout the film. And I think at that point, it wasn't important for me to figure out where exactly they were, but to understand that they're constantly in different places. And then their relationship with the environment also changes, which is very consistent with the way that the film is presented itself, with like footages from different time space, piecing together into like this very, how should I say, this very open narrative.
I wonder if Surabhi wants to comment on the structural part of that and the editing choices.
Yeah. So yeah, no, the fact while I kept working with the material, as you know, that I had also shot a lot of performances, and in performances, the space opens up, right? Because now you suddenly have the audience and you have the singer, and there is a way in which you can then know broadly where you might be. So I had all that material, plus I had stuff that I hadn't shot, but that had already been shot as documentation of the project, both in India, Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai. But I kept getting drawn more and more to that space of the musical conversation or the rehearsal, rather than, again, as I said, the finished piece. And then the more I worked with that, the fact that it just so happened that the majority of the spaces are either with black walls or dark enough to make it seem like it's a very closed, almost claustrophobic space. There is no sense of the outside. And there was this one space that was fully white, but equally closed, and I started thinking through what that could mean. And that's why this black box and the white box idea worked for me, because in a sense, this project is a kind of a fiction that we are putting together, right? These are not musicians that have organically sort of circled each other, found each other, somewhere and started this conversation. Plus the fact that these are these scripted spaces without a sense of the outside made me also think about this moment in time today, where we are bringing together this conversation versus a long history of very organic conversations or missed conversations that happen in port cities, in bazaars, in marketplaces. I like the fact that we were completely highlighting the fact that this was artificially or fictionally put together. And then that was another way in which I started paring down material. So two things were sort of motivating these closed spaces. One was, this was where the initial part of the conversations, or the bringing the musical structure together, was what was happening. And the fact that it was in a kind of almost overwhelmingly closed space. There was no outside, there was no reference. These two things sort of started then. In fact, 2 or 3 performances that I really, really loved in terms of the music, and in the fact that they had very little technical problems, because I was shooting this for the first time on my own. I let go of them. They'd become favorites of mine, actually, because they were suddenly giving, weirdly to say, a breathing space that I did not want. There's this tension that in the viewer, that it never goes out. And I like that, again, because I was not working with a narrative of, this is the tension, this is how they came together, this is how they resolved it. There was no, there was no movement forward. So I had to forcibly create a tension. This was another way to do that. I don't know if I answered the questions, but these are some of the thoughts playing out in my head.
I would like to call on Johnson Chang, the biggest and greatest supporter of the Saath-Saath project, whose video isn't working, but hopefully you have something to say about the film and the project, Johnson.
Hello, thank you so much for this beautiful film, Surabhi. I was mesmerized because I thought, well, I saw part of it, and then I saw the performance as well, and so I thought I have an idea. But then the film actually captured what this whole Indian-Chinese exchange. I think it really captures the essence of that exchange, because it is more than exchange. It was actually bringing, moving forward, and also showing up characteristics which I would not have noticed before this attempted dialogue. And in a way, it always, there's always something magical about all the endeavors I've tried to bring China to India or India to China, is that there is this incredible sense of experimentation and openness in whether it is in visual arts or music, in the traditional Indian practices. But then there's also this this love of complexity and structures which are so pared down, and yet it can become so complex that it becomes almost well, it's both transcendent and also both mesmerizing and hypnotic. So is that sense which I don't see, which I find so different from what a Chinese artist would do. And in this music here, I love what Tejid said about the voice and the instruments, how the foregrounding of the singing voice, and how the instruments, which is being mediated, a kind of mediated singing, which is used in by where Chinese musicians tend to think about. And in this exchange, in the music, there is very clear how Chinese musicians bring up are brought forward in the music by a narrative, even as though the whole musical piece is pared down to become a narrative, while the Indian musicians take pleasure in just exploring the multiple possibilities of playing around with the structure, with the internal formal logic, or the endless possibility of permutation within the structural, or within the narrative that tries to move forward. But the formal experimentation keeps bringing the narrative back to something more elemental, and throwing it open again to a kind of a much more complex, well, before narration, before structure comes in, because structure always means paring down. Narration always means, in a way, simplifying to a purposeful direction or purposeful end. And but then here we see how these musical phrases keep being pulled apart and being elaborated, so that it becomes a world, even without necessarily having this narrative story, or a beginning and end to the performance. So I sometimes feel that unless I have the time to have or unless I do not think about time or the end of my period to listen to, or in a musical concert, this whole thing of music playing is in fact like a full life. Whereas in the narrative songs, there's always an end. So it is these two dynamics that I find so mesmerizing when I see the artists work together. So this film, for me, highlights that dynamic exchange and this sense of exploration from both sides. One pulls forward, one pulls backwards, one pulls together, one opens up. So I'm very grateful to have this interpretation by Surabhi.
Thank you.
Pedro, is there any question that you want to ask?
Actually, there's a question to me from a member of the audience. It's a rather large question. I don't know how many people here know my Caribbean project. So I'll try to keep the answer brief, and I'll mention it only because Surabhi is also a fellow traveler in that project, and I'll mention it. So several years ago, Surabhi and I went to Jamaica and Trinidad in the Caribbean. I had already written a book on my experience of many years and the question of women and music in the Caribbean, focusing especially on the Indian diaspora in the Caribbean, looking at women of Indian origin who sing what seems like not Indian music or African music, what they call the calypso. Yes. So I was very fascinated by that transformation of the Indian woman in that kind of space, disconnected from Indian histories, but still calling themselves Indian. And Surabhi and I took a very famous rock star from India, Remo Fernandez, to the Caribbean for a month and a half. We traveled with him across the islands, engaging in collaborations. And I think that Surabhi produced a remarkable film, Jahaji Music, based on that. I'm sorry, there's a train going past. Okay, I think he's gone. Perils of living here behind whatever. To come back to this idea, the question was, how is this different from the Caribbean project, and how is it similar? And I think the differences and similarities are a little obvious. So I don't need to dwell on them. It's an attempt at working through musical collaboration as conversation and working through practice as research. I think these are the two aspects that connect the two projects. The differences are enormous, because while the Caribbean was exotic and alien for us, it was still sort of familiar. Maybe because the Indian has gone and inserted herself into that space, the Indian has become part of that space in the Caribbean, which is Western and not Western at the same time. For us, I think China is truly opaque in a way that we don't see those connections or resonances or histories, although the histories exist. I think because of the kind of break that I spoke about earlier, the attempt to overcome that opacity or to engage in a collaboration was far, far more difficult than anything we've ever attempted before, for example, in the Caribbean. So I just want to point to the difficulty, and partly caused by language, partly by disparate histories, lack of connection, and partly by the kind of very interesting observations that Johnson is making. Different histories of cultural practice, different directionalities of cultural practice, different objectives of cultural practice. I think that these seem to be very stark and very divergent in a way that we haven't experienced before. At least me and Surabhi have not experienced before, because we work together on other projects. I wonder if Surabhi would like to say something.
No, not really. I think you've covered it. So, yeah, I'll come back to it. Yeah.
This is a question from our friend Anmol Belani. He's asking about my specific comment, which Surabhi has pulled out of nowhere and stuck in there, causing this difficulty now, that I say something about resolving the musical tensions, which have to do with the question of the nation, the question of the classical, etc. This is not a fully worked out argument, Anmol. It was something that was part of a long discussion we had in Hutong in Beijing. And Surabhi pulled out the sentence to stick in there to indicate that we were grappling with these larger questions. I'm really not sure how to answer this. I think that Unlike the other projects where I worked with musicians and worked with Surabhi, I was able to actually write a book or write a long text alongside to make sense of these questions. I have not done that at this time. I'm hoping to do that, and I'm hoping in that text to be able to elaborate more effectively than the film could do, because the film is a different kind of project, how the music helped to resolve, for me at least, as the researcher asking these questions, the kind of tensions I was talking about. Because we're really looking at two very different kinds of entry into the modern world, into the formation of their own modernities. These are very distinctive, very different. They do, I think, have a bearing on how the musicians engage in their cultural practice, what is familiar to them, what is not familiar to them, the privileging of Western music in the Chinese context, which has to do with that kind of entry into modernity that India, I think, did not do the same, go the same direction because of colonialism and because of a very active sort of, engagement with colonial society and the attempt to produce something that was Indian. I think all of this is there. Yes, I think the question is very challenging, and it's something that I will take into the writing project. And I hope in a year or two, I will have help to answer this. Thank you for asking.
But can I also respond to this? Because, as Teju said, this was spoken, in fact, all the texts that we have, that I've put into the film are spoken in a context, in a much longer conversation. And I pulled them out. And I pulled them out and did not put them in an order that would sort of contextualize the question. But for me, each of those text pieces that I've put, whether it's a question or a statement, I was hoping to sort of provoke another way of thinking about these repetitions happening in the musical space, in a sense. So a lot of the texts that I've pulled out are also repetitions. Sometimes people are saying the same thing, but sort of in an attempt to perhaps articulate, perhaps to come back to the same place. And certain questions are being asked without actually being resolved either in the film or actually in that conversation itself. This was a question that Teju provoked all of us into. It did not lead to a closure of that question. So I really enjoyed playing with these pieces of text to also sort of interrupt a certain comfort zone that comes in when you're listening to someone repeat the musical phrase over and over again. So, I wasn't sure whether it would work. This was something I was really trying out for the first time. So thank you for the question, Anmol, that it did stick out. And I'm still not sure whether it's a provocation that works for the audience or not, but it was something I was quite eager to try out. Yeah.
We also have a comment from the Q&A box. I will read it out for everyone. So as I watched the film, it was very powerful to watch and experience the diverse emotions of the artists as they collaborated. There were so many different emotions, from excitement to frustration to joy to more subtle layers. Somehow in all these, I found it interesting that restraint, which seems to be a form of thoughtful relationship building in both cultures, held it all together. I may be wrong in my perception, but the thoughtful restraint through all the varied emotions was very moving to watch as an integral part of the diverse artistic process at play. Would you guys like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think maybe I will. I think it's a beautiful beautiful observation, because very early on when I gave up, and Johnson actually put it beautifully, the difference between a structure and a narrative. So obviously in the initial stage, I was trying to do the obvious, that is put together a narrative. And typically in musical collaborations, and in the previous films, we've had those moments. There are tensions, there are disagreements, there are fights, there is the obvious kind of conflict. But here I found it missing. Strangely, this word restraint is perhaps what I found. That it was very mindful of each other's very different spaces and different vulnerabilities. Sometimes you knew the other person was in a vulnerable space. You might not understand why, but but you were mindful of that. That mindfulness was also very beautiful to work with. And I kept building on that. Then I started looking for text I could bring in, comments that might break this restraint and mindfulness. But there again, I found that I was actually replicating the same, again, I'm using the word, this kind of a circular, everyone was circling around each other in a very, in a way that was both listening attentively, but also trying to find a way to come in. So I thank you for the comment, because that word restraint did keep coming back to me when I was working with the material and saying, why did no one lose their temper? Why did no one walk out? But yeah, it was quite a beautiful experience to be part of and to work with.
Teju, do you have any comments to say? No. I think throughout the conversation, I find that language or to have a dialogue with each other is a little bit hard, because I was adjust to that way of using music, using listening as a way to communicate. And then now coming back to finding the right words, finding the right language to talk about the film became a little bit difficult to me. And I realized I haven't asked Teju about your involvement in the filmmaking, and then also your feeling towards the documentary. I kept saying that it's a documentary, but I felt that it's not a documentary because it didn't really tell a story. It's really more experimental than that.
Yeah.
Well, I think Surabhi and I have been on a very long journey together through multiple projects, and each time the filmmaking has changed, just as my research has changed. So I'm sure that we are also feeding off one another's interests and directions, etc. And I think you can see that in the film as well. I have worked very closely with Surabhi on the earlier film projects as well. I am not a filmmaker. I don't really have a huge filmic sensibility, but I think that we are both committed to multimodal ways of representing our interests, our research questions, our practices, and so on. So I think that I don't know about the restraint, but I think there is a great deal of respect for the way in which each one of us handles the material that we are most familiar with. For me, it's the word. For Surabhi, it's the visual image, the camera, etc. Right? So I think that my tendencies, of course, I will tell her what I think of the sequence or the shot or the editing, but I will say, you're the one who's the practitioner of these, of these ways of proceeding. So you will take the final call. And I'm just offering my, opinions here. I do work very closely on the textual parts because that I obsess over those. And I have also gone back and forth with her on those things. And I think that, when she's shooting, I'm part of what is being shot. So I'm never really involved on that directorial or shooting side of pointing to her, why don't you cover this, or you don't miss this, etc. Right? Which maybe someone else might have done, but that's not my mode of engaging with the director. So in a sense, both of us are doing what we do best, but we also dabble in what we don't do very well. And that's how I think we have people with different abilities and different kinds of practices who are so good at what they do. And bringing all this together is to some extent my effort, because I see the potential in all of these. And I think bringing them together would actually enhance the scope of what we are thinking about, the project itself, and the ability to locate it in the world and to show what has been made possible by this conversation, which I think doesn't easily happen. I'm sure all of you know about border tensions, about all kinds of daily irritations. The whole question of India and China is like a hot topic, sometimes for no reason at all. And here in this space of music, we don't have any of those frustrations. So I think it's an important space to hold on to and to explore.
I wonder if anyone from the audience or from the panel has anything more to share about this documentary and also about Saath-Saath Project.
So no, I was just reflecting. Thank you, Johnson. What you spoke was very, I don't know, it really opened up a lot of things. What you shared was precious. And because of the restraint, it kind of brought back a lot of, I just wanted to add to that, saying how I think there was a sort of a pushback or holding fort from both all the artists, be it from China, Hong Kong, or from India, that you can't generalize everybody. Like we thought we all have these common things. First we thought, okay, we have some things common, they have some things common, culturally representing. But then when it came down to individuals, this project, you could see that it was not just each artist had our own kind of play of tension, friction, holding, support, and everything going on. So it opened up so much within us itself to reflect back on our practice, our individual practice, where we come from, our own perceptions of music. So this is about the project. The project really, with this project as the backdrop, it started giving a different way to look at our own music also, the music that comes from India. And similarly, there were moments when each of the Chinese artists also made it very clear to say, this is my take, this is my stance, this is how I would want to treat music, to make sure there is nothing assumed or generalized. So that restraint that was mentioned, so to kind of respect the fact that as individuals we have our calls. And what is remarkable about what Teju did was to be like a Tanpura there. She'll just hold that one constant there, not really kind of pushing us towards something, but at the same time reminding us constantly to stay somewhere in that course of process. So as a curator, she didn't bring us there and say, now give me this result, or nothing like that. She actually sat back to see what unfolded. And I think that's quite bold in a way.
And I'd actually like to add to what Bindu has said. I think it's really important also for me when I was reviewing the material over and over again, because for the longest time, as I said, I didn't know how to bring this material together, was the fact that there were times when the musicians were actually trying to find this idea of what is the difference and what is the same, right? There's this kind of, what typically you would assume happens in this kind of fusion, like let's bring the similarities and the differences and play with that. But because they were not working towards a goal, there was a way in which they went past that, trying to find the difference and similarity business. And they began actually just circling each other to find some way of talking musically. And of course, eventually it did have an outcome. They do have 2 albums with X number of pieces in each album, and each one is gorgeous. But at the time when they were sort of experimenting, they were not working towards, okay, what is that next composition that we have to work towards? And I think I was able to sort of capture that moment of neither fully unsure nor fully sure. And that becomes, I think, intriguing. And again, it's an interesting space to immerse yourself, to again think about music crossings, 2 musics, 2 musical traditions with its own histories. And you can keep going on further and further outside that zone in your head. So, yeah.
Thank you, Surabhi. We have one more comment from the audience. I'll read it out. I am deeply moved by this film. The title Movement Traces also resonated with my sentient experience of the collaborative musical journey of these gifted artists. I came away surprised at how the musical scale in Chinese music today is different from the Indian music scale. Given the history of the two countries, especially in the realm of wisdom teaching, I never knew that the music between the two countries today is so opaque to us instead of being transparent. However, the way Surabhi edited this film together, I find it an intimate experience of sitting amidst all of you by a warm fireplace with love and joy bonding us all in unicity and oneness, in celebration of these ancient cultures and their sensitive artistic expressions through music. It's a really beautiful comment.
Thank you.
Is there any more questions? And if we don't have any more questions or comments, I think we can call an end to today's discussion. I was especially impressed by what Johnson was saying at the end of his comment about how music has a beginning and an end, and how in this film, you don't feel an opening and an ending to it. And I think for the Saath-Saath Project as well, there's no ending towards music making and towards this cultural and musical crossing. And I'm sure Saath-Saath Project will continue this collaborations among different cultures and among different musical traditions. So thank you all for sharing this beautiful film and to share your thoughts tonight. And shall we call it a night?
Thank you, Changchu. Thank you, Johnson, for being here. It really means a lot to us. Thanks to all our wonderful musicians, and thanks to Surabhi.
And thanks to BIC.
Thanks to BIC.
Many thanks to BIC for hosting us again. Yeah, thank you so much. And to the audience who was there and who watched the film. Thank you.
It is quite remarkable to be able to collectively be moved by a work of art at this particular moment in time, and to do it virtually is really a testament to the transcendence of music, the image, and just the beings of artists, I suppose. Thank you, Tejo and Surabhi, for bringing these stories to us periodically. Thanks to all the contributors and collaborators. Thank you, Tang, for holding together this conversation so beautifully. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining us, for all the lovely comments and questions. And good night, everyone, and see you next time.